If we go back in the recent past, the green component of nearly $430 billion in global financing stimulus packages during the last recession of 2007-8 had set the tone for climate positive actions the world is witnessing now. A lot of spending then was dedicated for environment focused initiatives like renewables, energy efficiency, electric vehicles, etc., according to research by HSBC. While the US, China, European Union, and South Korea were at the forefront of dedicating big chunks of stimulus spending to sustainability, India had passed up the opportunity then. But now renewable energy is a mature industry, and possibly could that be the answer to India's climate goals and energy security? This is the question we will try to answer in this webinar with the help of our eminent panelists. On behalf of Policy Circle, I welcome our eminent panelists, Dr. Aruna Sharma, former Steel Secretary, Shri Pankaj Batra, who is the Project Director at Integrated Research and Action for Development, or IRADE. He is also the former Chairman of the Central Electricity Authority. We have Shri Pankaj Satija, who is the Chief of Regulatory Affairs at Tata Steel. And we have Shri Gopal Jain with us, who is a Senior Supreme Court Advocate. So welcome to all of you, eminent panelists who have found time to answer some of these questions on energy security for India. So let me kick off this discussion by asking each of our esteemed speakers to probably tell us in 3-4 minutes how they define energy security post COVID-19. So I'll first go to Shri Pankaj Batra. What is your definition of energy security for India post COVID-19?
Yeah, energy security in general, whether before or after post-COVID, is having adequate supply of electricity to each and every person of adequate quality. In brief, this is what energy security is. It's not counted in terms of per capita consumption, because you can have the same level of comfort with reduced consumption depending on how efficient the system is, the whole system from generation to transmission to distribution, and of course consumption in appliances. That's the utilization part. So it's just to see that there's adequate capacity of adequate energy available to be able to cater to the entire needs of a nation, including reserves, in case there is some pandemic which increases, not necessarily pandemic. It could be any of any catastrophe which could take place, to see that you have adequate capacity to feed everyone, even if you have these disasters or whatever. So that in brief is what energy security is. There's one thing which can be mentioned, is that in some countries, including ours, for gas-based power plants, we do not have sufficient domestic gas in India. So if you depend on imported gas and there is a problem in supply chain, then it could cause a problem of not being able to generate enough electricity. So these sort of things are especially need to be considered in terms of pandemics like this, where you sometimes have supply chain problems of transportation. So taking into account all this, also you should be able to cater to everyone's needs in the nation for supplying energy. Thanks. Anindya, you're muted.
Yes, I just unmuted myself now. So now I will invite Dr. Aruna Sharma to share with us her take on the definition of energy security post-COVID-19. Ma'am.
Well, Mr. Batra has very properly explained the technical definition. So I'll not repeat that, but I'll add on 3 things. That one, yes, it has to be secured, that we must be able to generate to fulfill our requirements. I will just like to add on to that, the futuristic requirement investments also has to happen now. And I'll also like to add that it has to be at the affordable price, right? So whatever sources we are thinking for energy security within a country for 1.3 billion population, it has to be something which is at affordable rate, which ensures sustainable flow, in the sense undisrupted flow, and which gives a secured kind of an assurance that there will not be disruptions. Then it is equally important when you are looking at the sorts that we, and what Mr. Batra rightly said, that the country can handle without any dependence on external sources in case of calamities, in case of any external relations going sour, or any external calamity that is coming up with that. So that is how you look at the security. So when you are looking at a huge population and the growing demand, and here I like to just make one mention that our per capita consumption is very, very low. If you look at the futuristic demand, then we should not be very happy being energy surplus as on date, because our requirements are going to soar up, both the domestic as well as the industry. And then when we sort of try to peg energy security, I think we'll have to take care that we are also identifying and investing sufficiently to take care of the graph which is going to grow in geometrical proportion in the coming years, so that we are able to cater and India can continue to claim to be energy secure. So I think at the initial stages, I'll stop at this stage, and then of course the co-panelists can add.
Thank you, ma'am. I'll now go to Mr. Satija and I'll ask him, how do you see energy security differently in a post-COVID future from today? What will be the difference?
Yeah, good morning. So already Mr. Batra and Dr. Sharma had explained. So I'm rephrasing it what they have said. For me, energy security means 4 A's: availability, accessibility, affordability, and acceptability. And Mr. Batra also pointed out the geopolitical conditions where India is with the neighboring countries and the supply of. And ma'am also pointed out very well about the affordability part of the socio-political angle or sustainability angle of energy security. But when it comes to industry, I am reminded of a story of a conversation of God with a bird. Uh, Upon a time, God called one species of bird and told that, you will not be able to fly. You will have to walk. And then God told that you won't have to be in a very good climate. You have to be in a very frigid climate, -80 or -50. And that bird is penguin. They landed in Antarctica. So as usually birds have to fly to get the food. So it was a very difficult and challenging environment for that particular species. But what they did, they started huddling together and making a pattern where the bird at the outer periphery are for a short time facing the wind, and they start rotating internally so that at no particular time the bird is exposed to the wind. So if you see the industry like that, when we talk of energy security, industry has taken its own path. Ma'am was former Secretary Steel, so she is very much aware that how Indian steel industry has taken use of waste heat recovery, TRT, and all those things where they are using the waste heat recovery, flue gas, and making electricity out of it. So most of the bigger players, they are around 60 to 70% meeting those requirements internally and depending 30% only on the fossil fuels externally. You asked about COVID. COVID has given new symptoms, new direction, and we have seen how global financial crisis has happened. And after that, how the emissions went up because everyone was on, a spree of making the productions. And people also say that after the global financial crisis, uh, the credit outflow and the insolvency, they were. So we also are not sure that how it will pan out in future. But there are different forecasts which have been given by different SBI has forecasted -6.8%, ICRA -0.5, CARE rating is -6.4, CRISIL -5. It came in May and July. And OECD has a twin forecast that if Corona comes in second wave also. So if you see the TERI forecast of 2025, it says that pre-COVID, if the total demand was 1577, in 2025 it will be 1502. And there are different predictions of L-shaped recovery, V-shaped recovery, bathtub recovery, extended bathtub recovery. But almost in all the cases, it is coming out that it will be little short of pre-COVID in 2025. So there are various measures which the government is taking, and the industry is also taking, like, for electricity, there is expansion and modernizing the grids, accelerating the growth of wind and solar, as you also mentioned, the transport, the new vehicles and electrical vehicles. For the buildings, energy efficiency measures, industry has been doing. There are further good scope of improving the efficiency. And though Corona has come, but then when we talk of Corona warriors, I must appreciate the kind of electricity supply it has been to the industry or to the commercial or to the households and to the hospitals, that we are able to do our job. And today, if you are attending this webinar, it's all because of the continuous electricity supply. So I always reminded of a very optimistic and positive couplet of Ahmad Faraz, कि रात जब किसी खुर्शीद को करे शहीद, सुबह एक नया सूरज तराश लाती है. So I am very much optimistic that it will again back to the pre-COVID level.
Thank you, Mr. Satija. That was a very colorful description, I can say, of energy security in the post-COVID world. And now I'd like to bring in Mr. Gopal Jain and request him to probably point out any, what are the kind of differences that energy security will have in, in the way we see it now versus post-COVID-19.
Yeah, thank you. I think firstly, energy security is another facet of what the Prime Minister called Atmanirbhar Bharat. So when you look at energy security, you have to see it in the broader canvas of his clarion call of being Atmanirbhar India. And like the news, now it's very much 24/7, 365, with work from home a reality, with online education and things moving, which we witnessed in COVID as well, that the telecommunication operations and electricity operations literally ran 24/7 to keep the lifeline of people and the economy going. And third, in one line, you asked, in a post-COVID world, we need a regulatory vaccine. So I think one of the most important things to achieve this mandate of energy security is what I call a very supportive and enabling regulatory policy regime, vastly different from what we saw if you really want to give this objective a big boost. This has 2 or 3 important critical facets. First and foremost, that regulatory policy decision-making has to be principle and goal-based. It is not to micromanage and control business. So businesses must have their full play, like we freed up generation and we've seen the benefit of that. And all that regulatory policy does is it creates, as I said, a very enabling, supportive environment. And again, borrowing an expression from the COVID period, it's the health of a sector. So the vaccine that I refer to must be to make it financially strong. It must require fuel support, linkage support. And I think DISCOMs, the state of finances of DISCOMs and DISCOM reforms will be absolutely crucial, because if you don't have that, you can do whatever you want, but it's always held it back. The other aspect which I think is significant is what I call the sanctity of contracts. And in fact, we are now likely to see a new legislation, which is an amendment to the Electricity Act. And the importance attached to contracts or the sanctity is there is going to be a new contract enforcement authority. So I think the experience of the last 15 or 16 years, and we saw how one of the states decided to just renege on all contracts with one sweep of the pen. All this adds to uncertainty and unpredictability, and therefore risk. And if you want, as some of the earlier speakers said, if you want to augment capacity, you want to have adequate availability, you want clean and renewable energies to take off, you want to see far more investments. And investments will come when you have policy predictability, and regulation and policy making must support the ease of business. So what is generally said, it should no longer remain lip service. Each should support the other. So you will attract more investment. And then the 3A theory of availability, accessibility, and affordability could be met. And of course, viable tariff support. You don't want to have huge gaps, which we've seen in the past. So all the ailments which the conventional sector underwent is something which we should avoid. And I remember in January this year, the Brazilian president was to be the chief guest for the Republic Day. And I was having a conversation with the Brazilian ambassador. And he said that there's an Indian company which has invested 2 billion in Brazil. So I was first wondering, why is it that an Indian company would go that far to Brazil? Because we don't really have a very strategic relationship. And it happened to be in the transmission sector. So I asked him, do you know why they went to Brazil? He said, yes, I spoke to the promoter. He's put in 2 billion. He said, when we come to Brazil, for 10 years, we know what the policy and the regulation is. It doesn't change. And that one single factor was good enough for us, and they're very happy. So the last point I want to make is there are best practices. And it's a question of like carbon or photocopying it, just following best practices rather than reinventing the wheel. Talk to people who invested in other countries, ask them the mantra, what is it that that country attracted them, what was the magnet there, and simply put it in force. And lastly, and most importantly, in our whole regulatory adjudicatory system, it has resulted in needless disputes, prolonged disputes, and if you have a tariff in a particular year, before it is finally decided, you'll see 2 more rounds of tariff. So it doesn't help. So we have to rethink the architecture on this regulatory adjudicatory mechanism and perhaps just have a single point to avoid disputes, because that also adds to a lack of investments. And if you don't have disputes, it results in more investment. So the larger objectives can be met if we create a proper landscape. As I said, rethink our approach, make regulation, policy making more nimble, more agile, supporting, enabling. It must be a package of supportive relief. So the health of the sector is in good hands. You don't want the patient to be on ventilator and then pull him back. You should prevent him from being on the ventilator. So that's my post-COVID regulatory policy vaccine formula.
That was a very enlightening talk on regulation and on how energy security could look different in a post-COVID world. Okay, so now that we have got all our definitions on what energy security could be post-COVID-19 and how we can think about it, let's go a little deeper into the subject. And now I will invite every panelist to share a more detailed perspective on various facets of energy. So we see now a bit of a tug of war between energy storage and coal. And the Indian government is also deliberating on the role of hydrogen in power sector and the transport sector. There is optimism also about the role of pumped hydro energy storage as a significant technology for balancing the grid in future when there are more renewables. Mr. Batra talked about availability of gas. We don't have many operational gas plants, but that's also a thought that we should have enough gas produced and operational gas plants for energy security. Now, there is also a belief that battery storage and renewable energy costs will come down even more in future. In fact, we've already witnessed competitive rates for round-the-clock clean power earlier this year. So keeping these developments as evidence in mind, I would like to ask Dr. Sharma to please throw some light on the relevance of coal for India in its electricity security in future. Do you see India's dependence on coal reducing rapidly in a post-COVID-19 future? And do you think we may never need to achieve the 1 billion tons production target by 2024?
Let me put the scenario very clearly. If you look at the pie graph, today more than 50%, I think nearly 61% of your energy requirement is coming from coal. And a lot of capital investment has already been done for producing energy from coal as your source. Then if you look at the caloric value that you will get also will be of a very high level when you work from the coal. Yes, you have an issue of air pollution, but there are technologies. What Pankaj Satija very rightly said, the steel industry has gone in for recycling that carbon dioxide and add on to the energy requirements instead of putting it in the air. So those kind of technologies are there. And if I compare it with the replacement by the non-renewable energy, or gas-based energy source, then yes, gas-based energy source will make us import dependent. Let us be very clear about it, because we are still at the geological survey stage to find more and more natural gas deposits, and then a huge investments to extract the same. So I don't see in immediate near future of India becoming self-sufficient as far as natural gas is concerned. It will be import dependent. So, but yes, natural gas will have its advantage of a cleaner energy as we are moving ahead with it. Then if you look at the non-renewable energies, today its contribution is 17 to 18%. And if the technology enables a better storage and better caloric value, and if you look at the impact it had on the tariff rates, it brought it down to 3 rupees 20 paisa or so. But if you look at it, the supply of, if you look at the solar energy, their contracts is with one user. The biggest solar plant, what we have in Riva, has a major contract with Metro of Delhi. So even if it's coming through the grid, that's where the whole negotiation is happening. So it's like sort of putting in the grid, but then the usage is in a reserved areas. So renewable energy is going to increase, but it is not going to replace the coal. We are blessed with coal. India has a natural resource of coal. And if you look at it, the America has brought back the coal to center stage. It generates a huge employment, which is possible in the coal sector. And that is why the US immediately decided to open up the coal mines, even though personally I will not agree to ignore the environmental factor of it. Now you have technology to mine the coal in an environment friendly way. You have technology to reuse the carbon dioxide which is released by the use of coal when we are moving ahead. As well as when you look at the kind of coal that India is blessed with, it is possible to go in for these. Having said that, what has been messed up today, and I will not like to mince words on that, and that is why we are looking at the new cleaner regulatory and what rightly Mr. Gopal Jain said, versus credible policies. You can't keep on doing somersaults and route. That if you look at it, the tariff rates of transport, the logistic cost is very high. Your power plants are not at the pit heads. They are far off. So you are traveling it. Our ash content is also getting traveled because we have not invested in washeries per se. So you have transporting an additional cost, a high cost for coal and ash to take it to the power plants. And these power plants, because of the lack of coal supplies or disruption in the coal supplies, did undergo a loss and are at the verge of NPAs and then going to NCLTs. So that hanging sword is lying on them. So we had this private sector investments in a very big way, which has gone for this coal-based plants. The other alternative, what you have, the hydro-based or the renewable energy-based, or a tiny bit by natural-based and very tiny bit by nuclear power. If you combine all of them together, it is no match to how much we are going for coal. But yes, not immediately, but 2 decades later, maybe this graph will show a change in the share in the pie graph. And that is what is going to make a difference. So when you look at it, the immediate concern has to be to use the coal which the nature has given to India, to use it environment friendly way, to use it efficiently, use the capital investment which has already been made over a period of time. And the beauty of the coal is it guarantees you the power security irrespective of the climate, irrespective of the season, irrespective of the change that is happening. So you have a consistent
Looks like we lost Dr. Sharma there. Okay. While she comes back, I'll move the discussion to Shri Gopal Jain. And of course, he has already spoken about regulations. Now, I want to add on to that. In the future, do you think we should have more state or regional focused policy and regulation, or we should have a more federal focused policy and regulation, which one can see in the long term, like you mentioned the Brazil example. I'm asking this because there is a school of thought that says that um, an energy security comes when every region can use what they have. So it's not like coal is being transported from one corner of the country to another. If coal is located in a particular area, it should be used by plants over there, and so then other regions can more fruitfully use other kinds of energy sources that they are rich in. So yeah, my short question to you is, do you think the regulatory vaccine should in future be more regional focused or federal focused?
So let's look at some realities. Uh, Power or energy is a state subject. You have every state has its own regulators. Some states, as you said, have reserves. Others don't have reserves. My point is, if you look at one India, one grid, and we really look at cutting across geographies, what we really need is a much more elaborate process of stakeholder consultation and engagement, so that we will be able to have a good workable policy which works across India. I mean, if you looked at when GST came in, right, between production states and consumption states, and then they sort of said, okay, let's change it so that everybody gets the benefit of, of trade. In the same way, if you look at the amendment which is coming to the Electricity Act, a large part of it is very federal structured, federal oriented. For example, selection. There will be a selection at the national level, right? Even for state regulators. So uniformity, consistency, and predictability is important. While what you said makes sense, but the moment we make this division, right, it never works because you always have conflicts. I'll give you another example. You look at the right of way issues. So for example, in telecom, right of way is important, but every state, every local authority has ROW, but you have sent obligations under a license given by the central government for penetration, but the ROW doesn't go hand in hand. So let's avoid this federal versus state, because that's a much larger debate. I think having uniform policies where you have much greater and effective consultation. If you look at the US FCC, they take 8 to 9 months of consultation, which happens at multiple levels. You have a lot of experts who come and depose. So experts are involved in it. It's very much to do with credible, scientific, it's evidence-based. Then you arrive at something. So I think if we work on those lines, it will cut across this divide. Otherwise, you'll always have this Lakshman Rekha or this turf war. So if you are thinking of one India, one nation, one grid, then why not have one workable policy, but which takes on board, like I said, effective stakeholder consultation, and which is much more goal-based. So you have a larger goal and everyone works in that national interest. So perhaps that would be a better way of doing it. And literally, like I said, you have to rethink, reimagine, and redo things. Why just carry forward something from the past? We can give birth to organic policy making as well, organic decision making as well. And that's really the way to go. Blurring these lines of distinction where you can have conflicts, and that's highly avoidable.
Okay. Mr. Batra, would you like to now probably add to what Mr. Jain has said? And if you could tell us the policy or regulatory measures required for energy security post-COVID-19. Do you differ from him? Do you want to add to what he said? It would be nice to know.
So, one is the question of authority and domain, of state versus center. Power is a concurrent subject, and so both have the authority. And the general interpretation is that the central government has authority on the interstate level, and the state has authority on the state level. But what's happening is that, as Mr. Gopal Jain said about policy certainty, as the party changes in the state, the policy also changes in the state. And sometimes that could be a dampener for investors. This thing can happen in the center also, But in general, the center's policies are more, in the sense of continuity, because I think everybody has now realized a developmental agenda is one works, where not only for the nation but also for elections, for winning elections. Everybody has realized that, and in general, I see that things are. I'm just giving a general thing, but maybe it's not valid for everything. But in general, you have at the center who looks at the country as a whole. Uh, the, the the exposure and capability levels are, I feel, a little better than those which are confined to within the state, uh, as well as the method of selection. So in terms of selection of people, as Mr. Jain said about having well, it's not exactly that only center will dictate on selection of regulators and these other contract enforcement authorities and others. It's a combination of the two, except that it is made more uniform in the sense that you will have one state representative, but the state will be in alphabetical order. So it's a state starting with A. That state secretary would be involved in the selection of the regulatory commissions of the state as well as the center. So I think it's a fair way, because we've definitely seen that, for example, the operations of a central power undertaking are generally better than those of the states, although some states would be performing well. So I think, and when you talk of the country as a whole, it's my feeling is that we need to have national policies, and so now what happens is that coal is located in certain areas, not in all the states. Now, if you say that only that state has got right over that asset, then it becomes a thing of how the other state's going to manage. The regional electricity boards were things which were, the 5 regions were developed in India for optimal utilization of the resources in the region, not of the state. So you expanded from a state to a region, and then from the region to the country. I think there's more optimal utilization of assets when you do it over a country. You can help both ways. It helps both ways. It's not that it helps only one side. Similarly, not going beyond that, going to even cross-border trade to other Asian countries. There's a lot of value to all the countries. You have a huge amount of hydro potential in Bhutan and Nepal, whereas you have a lot of coal-based capacity in India. So it makes for a very good mix. And when India is going to a lot of renewables in the future, which are intermittent in nature, you require these hydros for balancing. So if you have this balancing of the intermittency on a South Asia basis, we don't need to create our own hydro stations in India if it's not viable. There's a lot of potential in these other countries. So, but they also require our power, because what happens in Nepal and Bhutan, which are predominantly hydro-based stations, is that in winter, they've got a very low inflow of water, and therefore they're not able to meet all the capacity themselves. If every country was independently wanting to manage themselves, they'll have to build a huge capacity which would overflow in monsoon without being used, the power being used, and not being able to meet the demand in winter months. So that's a waste of resources, whereas the countries like India and Bangladesh would require that hydropower for balancing. India can provide firm thermal power, which is coal-based power during winter when they require it. It's a win-win situation for all countries. So but what must be carefully designed is that every country must share these benefits equitably. If it's inequitable benefits, these agreements will not last long. So that if you design the agreements which is equitable sharing of benefits, then these agreements last. Europe has been interconnected for years, so many years, but 20, 30 years, and is functioning well. And more countries are joining into that grid. So we can take lessons from that. So I'm just coming, you said about the state versus the center. So I just thought that a central thing would utilize the resources of the country much better. And we're not different countries. We're one country with different states. Every state can benefit from the other state. if you put the watertight compartments of the state that no trading can take place and everybody must utilize their own resources, it's going to be inefficient. So I think when you see the country as a whole, we need to have some policies which are national, and therefore it makes for more efficiency. Why do these countries, which allow a lot of for example, US is supposed to be the most progressive country. It allows so many people from so many countries to come over there and migrate over there. And this has really raised the level of competency in that country to huge amount. Similarly, now in India, what's happening is people from one state are going to another state to work. So if you start having boundaries, it's going to create a problem. So I think I agree with Mr. Gopal Jain that you must have national policies, and that's the way it should be. So some states, I mean, people can take advantage of any policy. Some states may feel that their jurisdiction has been encroached upon. But the other thing is they can also do it the way they want, without considering the national interest at all. So it can be both ways. Any policy can be used or misused. I feel that a policy in the national interest would always be better than independent state policies, and so also regulations. And of course, there's a balance of power. I'm sure the whoever is in the center will make sure that they do not unnecessarily encroach into the jurisdiction of another thing if it's not required, if it's not for the country's benefit, because they ultimately they need support from the states also. So I think I would agree to Mr. Jain that it should be national level policies and national level regulations or laws.
Thank you, Mr. Batra. It was a very exhaustive overview of what kind of policies we can look at post COVID-19 in a new normal, in a new future. Okay, so now I will, we've taken like a bird's eye view of things so far. So I'll now call in Mr. Satija to pick up his microscope, and if he could identify the main energy intensive industries or sectors and suggest how they can green their energy requirements in a cost effective way post COVID-19, because there's a lot of conjecture about how green technologies are expensive. For example, FGD, in thermal based plants is seeing a lot of resistance. So if you could probably explain, how greening energy requirements in businesses could mean energy security as well. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks once again. I was listening to Mr. Jain and Mr. Batra, and they talked about the uniformity in policy. Same thing applies to industry also, and it reminded me a couplet of Rig Veda, which says that Samaniva Hakuti Samaniva Samana Vastu Bhumana Yodhava Susahasti. And it means that let our aim be one and single, let our hearts be joined as one, united be our thoughts, at peace with all, may we together in harmony. So as you mentioned, asked about the different industry sectors and their requirements. So most of the industries, they have joined hands, and thankful to BE that the PAT cycles which they have implemented. So initially in the cycle 1, there were 478 DC designated consumers from 8 energy intensive sectors, and PAT cycle 2 was launched in 2015 and added 3 more sectors: refinery, railways and discoms. PAT 3, 535 DCs, total 621 DCs were analyzed for M&B. And PAT cycle 3 also added 116 more DCs. Now we are in the PAT cycle 4 and 5. So in the initial sectors, when this was launched in 2012, the major sector which were identified were thermal power plant, iron and steel, cement, aluminium, fertilizer, paper and pulp, textile, rural curry, refinery, railways, petrochemicals, buildings. So as together total there are 956 designated consumers. So that means that majority of the sectors are in. Now the mining sector, which has not been, they're trying to have the baseline data done. There are good practices across the world, like they have a system of, because in mining most of the energy is used in the transportation inside the mine, and most of the mining companies across the world, when they have a higher dumpers, they change it from diesel to electrical when they get the level surface. So if the mine is very deep, it is say 200-300 meter deep, and when the material is being hauled by trucks, so it uses diesel power, but when it comes to a horizontal surface, there it goes by the electrical transmission. There are pantograph which is installed and this can be switched over. So there are various enablers. Again, for the deep-seated mines, when it is open cast, they use lift, so that instead of falling, the lift from the lift, the dumper comes to the surface. So mining sector, as far as is not being included, but that will come. But the majority of the sectors have been included in PET cycle 5, and some sectors which are not there, baseline survey data has been done. There are certain good sectors also which they have come out with their own, like cement sectors, which are also known as hard to abate sectors. There had been certain declaration that by 2040 they will be carbon negative. Some companies, Dalmia, they have proclaimed. For steel, Tata Steel, Europe, we are going to be carbon neutral by 2050, and we are trying to use hydrogen, water electrolysis. And we are closely monitoring the development over there, and slowly that will also be implemented in Tata Steel India. So micro level, each company, depending upon their processes, trying to go for higher energy efficiency, going for circular economy, using their waste heat and other processes where they can be less dependent on the fossil fuel requirement. So that's the way majority of the industries are doing.
Mr. Satija, could you also maybe throw light on on how industries are finding it cost effective to have more sustainable processes in their operations, like sourcing green energy, or you mentioned electric transport, and you have also mentioned how Tata Steel Europe is going to go carbon neutral by 2050. Maybe if you could elaborate a little more how you're going to do it, and what is the rationale behind, what is the economic rationale behind such step?
So I mean, it has economic rationale. It's not just for the sake of doing it. It insulates us from the variability of the prices from the fossil fuels and others. You know how coal is being being imported in India. Most of the coking coal is imported in India from overseas, and that too from one country, Australia. And we also know that once a flood comes in Australia and Queensland, how the coking coal prices varies from 110 to even 300. So that's the volatility of the prices that every company would like to insulate. If you ask about the different measures what we have taken, so like we have also gone for increasing the use of agglomerates in the burden of blast furnaces, and the energy saving in 2014-15 was 3799 TJ per year. So then we have gone for power generation from TRT. We have increased the blast furnace productivity by commissioning high blast furnaces with high top operation, high agglomerating burden, and coal injection and automation. That has also given around 3,000 TJ per year. Then coke dry quenching, where we have tried to reduce the moisture and lower coke requirement with steam generation. Then installation of variable speed drives in our blast furnaces and operations. Waste heat recovery from flue gases of hot stoves at blast furnaces, that also is given. Little lower, 617, but then again, each small activities has helped us. So basically, it's baby steps in different. Together, when you combine, you see a good number coming out of it. So as I mentioned earlier, around 60 to 70% of our requirement we are doing internally. And for the balance, 25 to 30%, depending upon the plant location, we are dependent on fossil fuels. So various R&D projects also have been taken. As you asked about COVID, the impact of COVID is mostly on, I fear that most of the companies will, when they are cash starved or they have less capital, this is the one area which is impacted. But then again, when situation improves, there will be higher expenditure on R&D and innovation.
Thank you for that overview, Mr. Satija. I'd just like to remind all our participants to please put their questions in the question and answer box. We are soon going to go into a Q&A round, and I think the panelists would love to answer your questions. So please do that. We have less time to go into the Q&A round. So before we go into the Q&A round, I will throw open this question to both Mr. Batra and to Dr. Sharma. And everybody else. It's a common question. So I just want to talk about how regional energy trade can have a role in energy security for India. When we talk of regional energy trade, I also think of energy diplomacy, especially with the geopolitics going on right now. And India has a big role to play in South Asia. But have we acted on it well till yet? And post COVID-19, how does a regional cooperation with South Asia fit into the energy security not only of India but also the region? So I throw open this question to everyone, starting with Mr. Batra.
Sorry, starting with? Oh, you're muted.
With you, starting
Okay.
with you.
Okay, okay, right. Thank you, Anindya. So, one is the diplomacy which the Prime Minister has started about geopolitical reasons of being able to uh, of promoting trade with the neighboring countries, so as to one, uh, have more of influence on in this in this area, because there are apprehensions of if that is not done, then some other uh, nations would exert influence in this area. That's a big reason. But otherwise, also, as from the energy security point of view, if you have cross-border electricity trade, because of the diversities of demand, peak demand, which occurs at different times in these countries, because Nepal and Bhutan are hilly countries, so their peak demand happens in winter, whereas our countries, which are plains, happens in more of summer and say September, October. So because of the diversities of demand and because of the diversities of power resources that we have, it's a win-win situation for all, as I said. So you don't need to have so much capacity in individual nations as you would have if you were to trade between these nations. And as I said, the equitable benefits can be worked out and shared between the countries, so that no nation feels that it's at their expense. So, and this can be transparently worked out. This is what we are planning. We are doing in this program of South Asia Regional Initiative in Energy Integration. And this can now be seen transformed. This has been transformed into policies and laws. So in 2018, a revised guidelines for cross-border trading in electricity came out by the Government of India, which allowed these other South Asian countries to be able to trade in the power exchange in India. Power exchange, ours is the only country in South Asia which has power exchange, where you can trade power in as small time slots as 15 minutes. You're optimizing to the extent of even 15 minutes now. So if you allow this to happen, this is optimization at a regional level. So this is change which was not allowed earlier. The other thing which is allowed is that in case there is surplus power in Nepal or Bhutan, and even India cannot offtake that power, that this power can flow through India to Bangladesh and later even to Sri Lanka if it's needed there. So this is optimization again over a larger scale. These policies changed in December 2018. And now if you see the Electricity Amendment Act, which has come in 2020, it has defined a term which is called cross-border electricity trade. So now it shows the emphasis that the government has placed on cross-border electricity trade, having realized two reasons. One is optimization on a South Asia basis, and second is the geopolitical influence. So I think these are very correct steps which have been taken from cross-border electricity trade. We have worked out, when we have intermittencies of renewables, which is going of wind and solar, which are weather dependent. Now these are ones which you have no control because it depends on the weather. And the way we are doing in India is that it is limited to a state presently, but we are trying to see that that this balancing is done over the nation as a whole, because you have Bhakra and other storage reservoirs which can balance this, whereas the states which are Gujarat, Rajasthan, Maharashtra, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, etc. They have to balance this within the state, which is there's a shift in policy towards balancing over the country as a whole, so that you have better optimization, and then further to South Asian nations as a whole. We've actually worked out how much savings there's going to be in all these countries when you have this. And also for the other countries trading in a regional power exchange, which could be located in India. So there is positive benefits which can be quantified. I just like to say one more thing about propagation of coal, which Dr. Aruna Sharma said. True, we are meeting more than 70% or 70% of our energy needs presently, electricity needs from coal-based stations. And stations which have already come there, they are assets which are already there, and we must utilize these assets till the life of these assets, which should be good, because otherwise we waste these assets. Already there are some assets which are stranded, but these stranded assets had a reason. It was not necessary. It was when this power exchange came in the year 2008. Up till that time and up till 2011, we were in a shortage scenario. But what happened in 2008 was the power exchange gave an indication of the price which was discovered in the power exchange, gave an indication of the extent of surplus or deficit in the country as a whole. And whereas the long-term contracts were priced around 3 rupees, these were selling at 6 or 7 rupees because they were for a short time. But all the people thought this is a very wonderful way of getting money through power. So there were even cement plants who had captive power plants who started selling this power in the power exchange and getting a lot of money. And some people set up plants only for selling in the power exchange. Now, nobody realized at that time that this power exchange is a time which is a short-term price. It's not going to stay that throughout for 25. A power plant is not set up for a day. It's set up for 25 years and beyond. A lot of these people saw this, and there was, because of, you could say, greed in trying to make, the initial starters made a lot of money. What they were supposed to earn in 25 years, they earned in 1 year. So everybody thought this is a good business, and they would rather shut their cement business and enter only to selling power. So this was something which where a lot of private generation came up, whereas earlier it was just about 7 to 10%. Now it is the highest between center, state, and private. Private started coming up, and because it takes about 3-4 years to set up these plants, the effect of this started coming in 2011 onwards. And slowly our surplus, our deficit decreased. All these plants started getting used, but then it became excess because plants were coming in stages, and now we've got surplus stranded capacity. So it could be debated whether it's really stranded or not, because we are still not able to feed all our consumers in villages and in small towns. However, that is where the policy needs to be tweaked, because the state electricity boards which are already running, or state utilities which are already running into losses, would lose further, because these are low-paying consumers. They would lose further and go further into losses. So there's a policy which needs to be tweaked, that everybody must pay for the price of electricity. They must recover their costs. And if the government wants to help some consumers, they can do it through direct benefit transfer, just like they did in gas cylinders. So it doesn't change the tariff. Anindya, if I'm taking too long, let me know.
Yes, we have just eaten into our time for Q&A, but still we are going to take the questions. But I will come to now. I'll come to Dr. Sharma, because I asked her about energy diplomacy and energy security. Ma'am, if you could explain it briefly.
Yes, I'll be very, very brief, because Mr. Batra has analyzed the whole issue. I would like to focus on the technology that is being used for transmission. Our transmission losses, we are taking it as an excuse, and discoms are being heavily paid and compensated by the state budget and state treasuries. So this is becoming a big burden into the whole thing. And it is very, very important that what we are losing because of transmission losses and non-recovery in the remote areas or in the village areas, we are increasing the tariff in the industry. So our industry power is most expensive in the world. So when we are talking of Atmanirbhar, when we are talking of competitiveness, it is very important to rationalize it. You know, your average tariff is 7 rupees, where across the globe it is 3 rupees to 4 rupees. So if I compare apples with apples, we are putting our industry at a big disadvantage when we are working there. So it is very, very important that when we are talking of trading across the neighboring countries, the minimum distance of transmission is going to bring down the losses till we bring out with the technology where we reduce the transmission losses. We are selling power to Nepal, we are buying power from Bhutan, and there is a need to sort of increase our hydro powers. But when we talk of our topic of security beyond COVID, we will have to balance it out with coal, renewable energy within the boundaries, geographical boundaries of the country, because the relations keep on getting sour and sweet as we keep on moving ahead. So our dependency syndrome has to be something which we can handle in case that emerges. Then it is very important that interstate, our handling of the power consumption is also creating a lot of problems. There are some states which went for separation of feeder lines. There are other states which have not gone for separations. So, you know, you will have to come with a holistic view. There cannot be a patchwork policy where it has to be made very, very clear what will be the tariff rates. That has to be long-term agreement. The spot buying which happened and messed up by very high rates of tariff and resulted into huge losses when the tariff rates were rationalized, it needs to be also catered for when we are moving ahead. So with this kind of a scenario, when we are working, that yes, our coal production plants have to be optimized where capital investments have gone, because NCLT is again going to bring down the burden to the banks. And this writing off is going to be the taxpayers' money which gets written off. So it doesn't make sense. We have to optimize what is invested. We have to make it at an affordable rate. We have to have a consistent policy of the tariff when we are going ahead with it, reduce the transmission losses as we are moving ahead, and supplement it with the non-renewable energies as well as the hydro powers from the neighboring places where the investment should go. Because any new investment at this point of time, when we have surplus, is not going to help us in a big way. And our consumption graph is going to go up in domestic sector. The industry sector is becoming more like a captive power plant. But then our policies are such that when they, even if they have a captive power plant, they have to pay an extra fees, right? So that has no rationale. So you invest in capital, you invest in having your captive power plant, you reduce the transmission because there is hardly any distance travel. Wheeling charges is becoming an issue. So all this need has to be touched, and a holistic policy, which, like the example given for Brazil, has to be consistent for 10 years. I mean, absolutely no tweaking of it, because these are not small time investments. These are not tiny investments. These are huge investments. So that is a holistic approach. Consistent policy is the key if we are planning to move ahead with it.
Okay, that was a very interesting answer and a lot of new points adding to the perspective of energy security and external relations. Mr. Satija, we have a question for you from a participant, and this is Mr. Krishnanand Tripathi who's asking, do you have any plans to make Tata Steel's India operations carbon neutral in future on lines of your Europe plan?
Yes. So in EU also we have taken on a pilot scale, and success of that will be replicated in India also. So and we have also bought Hisarna technology from Rio Tinto. So many front we are to work on it, and the advantage of having Tata Steel Europe is mostly in R&D only. So once it is replicated over there, definitely we have a plan to replicate it in India.
Okay, that's great. Mr. Jain, I was thinking I will direct a question towards you on regulation, and I think energy storage is still a bit of a gray area when regulation is concerned. Are you able to give some view on energy storage? How important it is, and this entire delay on kind of classifying energy storage? What is your view?
Well, it's very vital, important, significant. There's no doubt about it. And as what some of the speakers have earlier said, this is exactly what regulatory policy has to do. It has to be forward-looking. It has to see the changes which are likely to happen, the innovation which is likely to come, the kind of needs which are going to come up, and address it upfront. We shouldn't be in a situation where we are confronted with a situation, right? But we don't have an appropriate and adequate regime for it. So, like I said, the lens has to be far more forward-looking. And my earlier comment, this is where best practices help. It's as simple as what I call being a good copycat. Just look at places where it's worked, and to start with, just copy it and make it your blueprint. So we are not like the demand-supply mismatch. We shouldn't have a mismatch between a situation on ground which is unaddressed, and then we play catch-up. The same situation with technology. Law always is trying to play catch up. So we should have on a real time basis an effective regime, as I call it, which deals with it. So there are no gray areas. I think avoiding gray areas is really the key thing.
Very useful. Okay, so one last question, and I'll just open it to answer from any of you. Mr. Akhil Joshi asks, are we happy with the pace of implementation of environment-friendly technology like FGD, air-cooled condensers, etc.? And what more should be done to enforce them quickly?
Well, I can sort of chip in the beginning. There is never enough into it till we reach to the Paris Convention norms. So there is always a scope for improvement. And if you look at it, the manufacturers themselves are now getting motivated to create the products which are environment friendly as we are moving ahead. And the star rating that is given to them, or the certification which is given to them, it is becoming a USP in advertising also when we are moving ahead. So that is a good symptom and a good way we are moving ahead into it. The industry itself is bound with the Paris Convention, and they have to achieve those norms by 2030 as we are moving ahead. And that investment, of course, because of post-COVID-19, it has gone into a back burner. But then I think by next financial year, it will again get a center stage, because we will be reaching to fulfilling these norms as we are moving ahead. So a straight one sentence answer is there is never enough for it. There is always a scope for improvement, and we have to keep on going ahead with it.
Anyone else, please?
Yeah. So, FGD is flue gas desulfurization, and Indian coal is only 0.5% sulfur, whereas imported coal is much higher. So the need of this, because it raises the price of electricity by about 12 to 14 paisa per unit. Initially, it was much more. It was 25 to 30 paisa per unit. But now, because a lot of manufacturers coming into the field, the price has reduced. Is that we actually need to see the rationale of whether emissions from coal, which is Indian coal, is really contributing to the sulfur oxides in this. Now, this was something which research needs to be done, and Tata Power had wanted to do this. I hope it gets done, because spending there's such a large fleet of thermal power plants in India that it's supposed to be completed by 2022. But the way it's going, I don't think it's going to be possible by that time. It has to be phased it has to be phased in any case, because you can't take all the power stations and shut down at the same time, because create a shortage. So it has to be phased. But I'm saying that we just don't need to copy and paste whatever is being done abroad, because imported coal has a lot of sulfur, whereas ours doesn't. So this needs to be checked, of how much effect it's going to have on this. Anyway, I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to interfere in the environmental norms which are already there. I'm just giving my feeling that this needs to be done. At one time it was to be done. I hope Tata Power does take it up and come out with recommendations. As far as yes, all the environmental norms are good for the country. The other thing is, in general, about we have to see environment, because that's overriding criteria for almost the whole world now, in everything. So, although I appreciate that coal is forming the mainstay of the Indian power sector presently, it should be replaced as and when these coal plants outlive their lives by renewable. And now you had a renewable plus storage bids which were called by MNRE, and the levelized tariff came to 4 rupees 12 paisa, which is the same as any new coal power plant would have, and a pit head plant. So if it is if it is a load center plant, it will be even more than that. So I think and this is of course considering off-river pumped storage, which is a pumped storage plant where you lift the water when there's excess energy back to the upper reservoir and let it generate when there's less amount of power in the grid due to intermittencies of renewables. And this takes half the time and half the cost as compared to river-based pump storage. So I think we need to look at it from that perspective also, to see that we have a gradual phasing, not that you close these plants which are prematurely, but plan in such a way that you don't unnecessarily build coal-based plants, because another thing is the amount of coal which is available in a country. This is, at the present rate of consumption, it will last you only for another 30 years. So what are you going to do beyond that? Are we going to just stop after that, shut down all power stations? We have to plan in advance. And therefore, this is required to be done. I think I'll stop at that.
Okay, I think this brings us to the end of our... Oh, Mr. Satija. Sorry, very sorry. Please go ahead. No, it doesn't.
No, I concur with the suggestion of Mr. Batra. I mean, this has been debated along at NIS also, and they also came out with alternate methods of ESP and dry solvent injection, DSI method to be explored for FGD. My point here is industry should not be dependent on the directions from the judiciary. They should introspect at their own interval and come out ahead of the curve, so that you should not be getting directions from. And if that happens, probably the efficient mechanism will come its own, and the solution will be from the people who know and understand the technology, and that will help the industry for a longer run. That's my point. Thank you.
Mr. Jain, do you agree? Mr. Satija says that industry should not depend from directions from the judiciary in matters of environmental norms, this, that. They should be free to decide.
Well, whether we both agree or not, the question is whether the intervention from the judiciary is going to be there or not. So it's in neither of our hands. But I think if you have a compliance culture and also court is less interventionist, then I think perhaps that's really the way forward. And they themselves have set what I call go and no-go areas. It's just that you have to stick to them. So if there's a violation of law, certainly you must intervene. But this whole culture of, people opposing projects and filing a plethora of applications which come in the way of stoppage and then delay and then stress and then IBC, that trajectory, I think in a post-COVID world, there has to be far greater practical, pragmatic approach from the courts, which I said should be less interventionist, but obviously address legal infirmities of violation.
Okay, thank you so much. That was a very good perspective there. So this brings us to the end of our very informative webinar. I thank all panelists for their wonderful views. I will just take quick 1 minute to summarize what everybody has said for everybody who joined in late, so as to have a quick takeaway. So Dr. Sharma has been talking about energy security and saying that futuristic investments have to happen now, so that energy security in the post-COVID world is affordable. And of course, Mr. Satija, Mr. Batra, they both have spoken about affordability, accessibility, and availability. Mr. Gopal Jain, who is a senior Supreme Court lawyer, had a very interesting take on energy security, and he says that there needs to be a regulatory vaccine. So there should be a supportive regulatory regime needed after COVID-19, in which laws are not playing catch up, and there is no micromanaging of assets or of business, but the whole intention of meeting next level goals. Mr. Satija, who is from Tata Steel, has advocated about how industries should be left to take their own decisions. Also because COVID-19 has induced a global financial crisis, and there are different predictions of recovery, and accordingly businesses have to adjust to all of that. And so there cannot be a futuristic solution that is in sight right now. Businesses are doing their best as they go along. As far as energy security and regional cooperation is concerned, we've had points from the panel. Dr. Sharma said that we need to be self-sufficient. India needs to be self-sufficient in energy resources because relationship with other countries keep on fluctuating. So India cannot completely depend on just energy diplomacy for having energy security. And Mr. Pankaj Batra added to that point, and he has said that there is no need for all energy assets to be situated in one country. Different countries could have complementary assets, and we could all kind of provide energy security to each other. Mr. Pankaj Satija has spoken about the best practices that industries are undertaking in the mining sector and all others. And he also made this point that any industry or any sector that adopts any sustainable practices is not because of charity, but it's because of economic reasons. He has spoken about a pilot that Tata Steel in Europe is undertaking to be carbon neutral by 2050, and it has economic reasons behind it. And if it is successful, and if they actually prove their hypothesis of that being economically viable, they are going to also bring it to India. There is an important point towards the end that both Mr. Jain and Mr. Satija have made about how industry cannot be interfered on by the judiciary every time. And Mr. Jain explained that point, saying that court after COVID-19 could be less interventionist. And the PILs and the plethora of cases, they come in the way of development, in the way of economic development and business decisions. We need a far more pragmatic approach, even from the courts, to aid industries, to aid business. And all these things, all these points, regulation, investments, laws, and a good policy plan are going to ensure energy security post COVID-19. Thank you, Mr. Pankaj Batra, Dr. Aruna Sharma, Mr. Pankaj Satija, and Shri Gopal Jain for your time today. I hope all the participants also had a lot of benefit from this discussion. Thank you all, and see you again. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Ma'am, you're on mute. Ma'am, please unmute. You were saying something.
I was just thanking all the co-panelists and to you for conducting very well. It was nice meeting all the co-panelists. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, attendees.